Hello, thanks for your company today. Always great to have your ears. Before I get into introducing you to our guest, could I ask you to vote for A Breath of Fresh Air, the podcast, in the Women in Podcasting Awards? It's pretty simple. Just head to womenpodcasters.com/vote. That's womenpodcasters.com/vote. Much appreciated. I'd also like to say a big thank you to each one of you who've been sending me emails requesting guests for the show. I want you to know that I'm onto it and will keep you posted with my progress. Now, you probably haven't heard much about my guest today, and I have to admit I hadn't either, but I'm sure after listening you won't forget him. Check this out. In music circles, New York-born Richard Gerstein is better known as Richard T. Bear, and he's recognised for being a fixture on the New York session scene, as well as for his work as a solo artist. His first album in 1979 spawned the disco rock hit Sunshine Hotel, which climbed the charts everywhere. Richard has made his mark both as a solo performer and collaborator with many artists, including Crosby, Stills and Nash, the Blues Brothers, Robbie Krieger of The Doors, Edgar Winter, Cher, and Gene Simmons and Peter Criss of Kiss. And now, after a 25-year-long hiatus, Richard's back with a sensational new album called The Way of the World.
Hey,
I call you Richard?
you can call me Richard, you can call me T-Bear, whatever you like.
Just don't call you late for dinner, right? What grabbed me first about your bio is the fact that you were born Richard Gerstein in New York City. So you were a good Jewish boy. You were then raised in the Caribbean. How did that happen?
Well, my family, my parents were in the garment business. So I was born in New York City, raised in the Caribbean because they had their factories all over the Caribbean. As a kid, that's where I grew up.
What was that like for you?
Oh, it was marvelous. You know, when you're a kid, your eyes are wide open, and to experience different cultures and different things that you never get to experience. It was beautiful. I got to hear, bands from Cuba and bands from Puerto Rico and musicians, all over the place. And I loved it, and I started playing percussion as a kid. And then my parents got a piano, and I tried to play piano like a percussion instrument. And that's one of the things I do well. I play keyboards well, but I can also play it almost like a percussion instrument.
Right. So you were first inspired by all the sights and sounds you heard around you there?
Absolutely. I mean, I heard bands from Cuba, Los Chevaliers de España, and all that stuff prior to the lockdown of Cuba by Castro. I have a song on the new album, The Way of the World. It's called Dinner for One. And that's a homage to the Buena Vista Social Club. I moved back to the city because they had to run a business, and that was headquartered in the States.
So tell us what young Richard Gerstein did then in New York City as a teenager, having been infused with all of these sounds from the Caribbean.
Young Richard Gerstein got a job at Manny's Music Store. It was the music store in New York City, where all the bands went through and all the roadies went through and all the producers. I remember as a kid getting my keyboard there. The owner of the store and his brother really liked me. So when I asked for a job, they gave me one. When I worked at Manny's, bands would come through and they would give us passes to get into the Fillmore East or Madison Square Garden, the Felt Forum, the Palladium, whatever, wherever they were playing. And I remember going to the Fillmore East and loving that venue because I got to see all the bands that I listened to on FM. I went down there one day and I had a pass and I sat down and I went down there because there was this band called Iron Butterfly that were headlining there. And they had this song called Inagata de Vida, which was an organ song, and it was like they had like an 8-minute organ solo. Yeah. So I wanted to see this guy play this solo because I was a keyboard player. I'm sitting down there and the MC comes out and goes, "Ladies and gentlemen, we have an opening act tonight." That wasn't on the bill, but it's their second show in the United States. Would you please welcome from England, Led Zeppelin? So Zeppelin opened for the Iron Butterfly and they tore the place down. It was the best rock and roll show and set I've seen to this day. And then I went down, I got a backstage pass. It was my first backstage pass. And these guys came in and they saw me kind of showing somebody a Wurlitzer or something. And they said, "Hey, kid, you play pretty good. You come down and we're going to have a big jam down at the Fillmore East tonight. And I went down and I stood on the side. I've never been on backstage. And I stood on the side. The jam was the Grateful Dead, Traffic, and Hot Tuna. And I'm standing there at the side of the stage. One of the roadies went out to give something to Jerry Garcia, and he pointed at me, and Garcia looked at me and gave me the come on out sign. And I sat down at the Wurlitzer and I played at the Fillmore East with the Dead. I thought from that minute on, the thought in my head was, I want to do this for the rest of my life. The Grateful Dead? Are you kidding me?
So you were pretty set on what you wanted to do from a very early age. You knew
Absolutely.
you were good.
That's actually where I got discovered. And I got discovered by a guy called Richie Havens. And Richie came up to me and said, I'm making a record. It's called Mixed Bag 2. He had just had a huge hit with Mixed Bag 1. He had played Woodstock. He'd opened Woodstock, and he was really well loved. And he was a beautiful, kind, gentle soul. He looked like the Black Moses. He had these long robes and beads and a staff. And he was just the most beautiful, wondrous kind of hat, And he said, I'm making a record and I'd like you to play on it. I love the way you play. And I said, really? And he said, yeah. I gave him my name. And he said, all right, come to this address. And I get up there and I go in the studio. And I got to tell you, Sandy, the best session players in the entire world were in that studio that night. And I walk in and I'm like the only vanilla fella, there. And everybody says, this is Richard Gerstein. And I'm feeling really apprehensive and nervous. And Al came up. Yeah, and Al came over and he kind of calmed me down. And I played on a bunch of tracks on that record, and that kind of launched me.
You were discovered because Richie Havens recognized something in your playing that he really liked. What is that?
I actually played differently than most other guys played at the time. I had this percussive Caribbean world music vibe mashed together with soul music, rock and roll, and maybe New Orleans Creole. So the guys that I listened to that I really followed were a British keyboard player called Nicky Hopkins, Leon Russell, and then another guy called Dr. John, Mac Rabenak. I liked the style of Leon a lot. And Nicky Hopkins played on all the British rock and roll records. So I put it together and sprinkled Gerstein in it. And then all of a sudden, I'm getting all these sessions to play on. People are noticing me with this band that I put together, and I get offered a record deal. I got discovered by Richie Havens. I got discovered kind of by Frank Sinatra and his crew. I got discovered by the Kiss guys. The management team and the producer of Kiss saw me playing, and he walked by me, and as he walked by, he kind of leered at me and made a face. And I'm playing. It's like, who is this guy? What is this creature? And then he came over later on and says, all right, there's two things that are going to happen right now. So what's that? He says, I want to get you high, and I'm going to have you play with one of our bands. And I said, okay. Then he got me to play with Toby Bo, My Angel Baby, which was #1. He had me play with Gene Simmons and Peter Criss, and then Ghostwrite with Kiss. That kind of pretty much launched me. I went to England with Gene Simmons and wound up playing on his album, and then him introducing me to Cher. And she said, well, I'm putting a band together and I want you to be part of this, and I want you to write me songs. And I was like, really? He goes, no, really. And I was amazed that she would want somebody that's doing so much rock and roll. But there I was. The only thing that's bad about when you get tapped on your shoulder to do a lot of stuff is that a lot of things happen at the same time. You can't do things. You got to pick and choose. I remember Cher saying to me, I want you to come out to LA. And she put me up in LA, and I worked with her on her album. And you meet so many people along the way.
And meet people Richard certainly did. He'd already spent time early on as Carly Simon's road manager. He'd opened shows for Jeff Beck and Richie Havens and guested on some of Pat Benatar's early demos. Richard T. Bear was in hot demand. He appeared on numerous recordings by artists like Crosby, Stills and Nash, the Blues Brothers soundtrack, Richie Havens, Kiss members Gene Simmons and Peter Criss's solo ventures, as well as projects by former Rascals members Gene Cornish and Dino Danelli. And one thing just kept leading to another.
I remember meeting in a bar. The coat check girl was fascinating to me. I really liked her. She was this kind of overweight, kind of mouthy, kind of hair done in really strange colors. And I said, who is that? When I was playing there, and oh, that's Allie. I said, well, what does she do? Oh, she's a songwriter. So I got together with her and I started writing some songs. And it turns out her name was Allie Willis. She wrote the music to Color Purple. She wrote the entire Boogie Wonderland album for Earth, Wind and Fire. She wrote maybe 70 chart top 40 records in 3 years. Wow. And she's in the Singer Hall of Fame. She was from Detroit. And she and I wrote a couple of songs for Cher together. One song that I can recall that got on the record, Young and Pretty. And then I wrote a song that Sean Delaney said to Cher, this is the song for you. He was brilliant in that way. He said, listen to Richard's song, Pain in My Heart. And she listened to it and she says, oh, that's for me. And she said, I'd like to do that. I just want to change the name from Pain in My Heart to Love and Pain. I said, go right ahead. And to this day, she says it's her, and critics say it's her best ballad she's ever sung. She did it on her TV show. She did it on her music videos. She did it on tour. Great song. And it was on my first album. And I got signed by RCA, and that's when I lost Gerstein. Gerstein was no more from that moment on.
They told you to dump it, or it was your
decision? They said, Jews don't sell in the South. If you want to sign this contract, change your name. So I had a big bear coat, kind of woolly coat. Yeah. And they said, you look like a bear. Let's call you Bear. Richard the Bear. And I said, okay, let's do it. Richard T. Bear.
And you've been T. Bear ever since?
And I've been T. Bear ever since, yeah.
So you were certainly on your way. That first album featured a number of notable contributors, didn't it? I mean, how did all of those names get on there?
You know, it was great people. You know, it was this New York City session player mafia that I belonged to. I was playing with, you know, one thing leads to another. I was playing with the ex-Young Rascal guys, Dino Danelli, who I considered to be the best rock and roll drummer I ever heard, period, to this day, and Gene Cornish. And I was doing a record with them at Electric Ladyland. And in the next studio over, you know, Hendrix was in there, and that was his studio. And then there was this organ player that came in from Wichita, Kansas, called Mike Finnegan. And I went, wow, that guy's cool. And so he and I started hanging out. And he got me interested in the blues. He was the best white blues singer I ever heard. And he played Hammond like no one else. I learned from a lot of these cats. And, you know, one thing led to another. And here I am playing with this one and that one. And it's just this domino effect.
So from that album, Red, Hot and Blue, the single off it was a disco hit called Sunshine Hotel. You weren't playing disco? What the hell?
I wasn't playing disco. I played rock and roll with a large helping of soul and R&B. So there was this song called Sunshine Hotel. I took my baby to the Sunshine. And there was a place on the Bowery called the Sunshine Hotel. It was this real dive hotel. I took my baby to the Sunshine Hotel. She said to me, she'd do me and she'd done me well. Walk on in, you need to ring the bell when you're living at the Sunshine Hotel. Cut that thing, and it was a smoking hot R&B rock and roll record. Smoking hot. Unfortunately, I was signed to the worst label in the history of labels at the time. They didn't know what to do with me. They didn't know what to do with that, but disco was happening. So what they did was they went and had somebody remix it into this 12-inch maxi single, and they started putting it out in discos. Put it Studio 54. Studio 54 started playing the shit out of that record. And then because Studio 54 played it, all the rest of the discos played it. And then when all the rest of the discos played it, and they looked at the charts, they went, oh my God, it's a dance record. Then it went to number 4 in the world. It was on fire. All of a sudden, I get like offers from Europe come over and be on this TV show, be on that big show and this show. And I toured as a promo thing all of Europe with that record. And then got invited to come over and play with my band.
You must have been pinching yourself along the way, were you?
Well, I was pinching myself when we got offered to be headliners over in Europe because I was the opening act. You know, when my record came out, I got signed by RCA and they went, okay, here's how we're going to break you. You're going to go and play all the big halls and all the stadiums and all the huge venues as the opening act for these headliners. People are going to discover who you are. So I was the perennial opening act for like 2 years. I would open for the Doobie Brothers. I would open for Jay Giles. I would open for the Outlaws. I would open for Johnny Winter. On and on and on and on and on and on and on. It wasn't fun. It was really hard work. And because nobody came there to hear you. When you're the opening act and you're opening for Jay Giles, for example, and they're the big band. The people paid to see Jay Giles. They didn't pay to see Richard T. Bear. In fact, I was in Cobo Hall, Detroit, playing there 2 nights with Jay Giles. And I walk out to the keyboard. The band sets up. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome RCA recording artist Richard T. Bear. And before I could say good evening, I got hit in the face with a tennis ball. Oh. And that's the kind of welcome you got most of the places you went. I did it, I paid my dues, and then all of a sudden I'm off in Europe and I'm a headliner.
It was around that time that you became friendly with Stephen Stills?
Yeah, Stephen asked me to join his band, and I said sure, because I loved Manassas, and it was after Manassas. And then I started living at Stephen Stills' house, and Stephen and I became really good friends, and we wrote lots of great songs together, and I helped him on a song he brought me into the Crosby, Stills, and Nash camp. And he had me help him with a song called Southern Cross, which was a huge hit for them. I had a really good time living with Stephen. I'll tell you a funny story. You know, I took a hiatus for 25 years. Then when I came back, I made this record called Fresh Bear Tracks. There's a song on it called Give It Up. And it's Stephen Stills and I wrote that back in those days. And I forgot about that song. And I was going through my warehouse where I have a lot of keyboards and things. And I found this box and I opened it up and there's all these tapes from the Crosby, Stills and Nash sessions. And they're all great. I mean, these are rough mixes and things that didn't get put on the record. And I see this one and it says, Give It Up, Stills Bear. I didn't even have a cassette player. I went out and bought one, put it in, and I went, this is a great song. This is cool. So I cut it on that album. It went to #1 in the Netherlands on the Hit 100. During COVID, Stephen Stills played on it and trades licks with Walter Trout. Walter's on it. Stephen and I, to this day, are really tight.
T-Bear, you talk about having had an extended hiatus. I know that in 1983 you gained your sobriety. What happened that you decided to opt out?
I opted out in 1983, and I hopped out because I was about to die. There's no question. I was living in Laurel Canyon. I was living in Wonderland, and it was crazy in those days. I had a vision of me dying. Honest to God, and I hope this helps somebody. I called my mom up. She flew out to LA, and she put me in a hospital. 5 weeks later, I came out of that hospital, and I took it really seriously. And I embraced the people that had gone before me and that would help me. We had musicians picnics every summer where all the bands would come that were sober and clean, and there were some great ones, and there'd be anywhere from 800 to 5,000 people would show up, and we'd raise money and put musicians into detox and rehabs. And I was on the board of directors for that for a long time, so I feel really great that I was able to A, stay sober and clean, B, give back to my tribe. What I was freely given, I gave back.
So T-Bear was back, clean and sober, but didn't make any more music for the next 25 years. Hang in to find out why.
So what you've discovered along that path was the fact that you can make great music and be clean and sober at the same time.
Absolutely. You know, this is an irony kind of thing. I met a woman while I was living in Europe because that's where I had a foothold. And then I got an offer to come to the States and do a demo with a guy called Greg Kinn, Our Love's in Jeopardy. He had a big hit. Came to LA and saw Stephen and all those guys. And I met a girl at the Viper Room, which was called the Central at the time. And it was Monday night. It was Chucky Weiss and the Goddamn Liars. It was a sober and clean LA band where everybody was, kind of in a 12-step program. And Chucky Weiss is famous for Ricky Lee Jones' Chucky's in Love. She wrote the song about him. I see a girl standing at the doorway, and she was really cute. And I walked up to a guy next to her, and I said, "Who is that?" He says, "I'm not telling you because I got eyes on that." And she was standing there with a cup of coffee, right? And I thought she was part of the program, the clean and sober, tribe. It turns out she had it full of whiskey and coffee. And I had 4 years clean at that time. But we got along together. I met her. I wrote her a note, handed it to her. And later on, we got married and had 3 kids. And she said to me, she says, "You're not going to like this, but it's time for you to quit the music business because you have to raise kids now. And I'm pregnant with our first, and you got to go get a day job." So I went out and got a day job. And for the next 20 some odd years, I sold light bulbs every day. And I sometimes went door to door selling light bulbs. And that's the way I lived in California. And when I got to the end of my rope in that situation with her, I got divorced and went to a place where someone asked me to speak about how sobriety works and how you can stay, being a musician. And she had only musicians appear at this event, just was every week. And I met her. I liked her a lot. There was some kind of spark there, and got divorced. And 2 years later, married her, and her name is Nina. And into the marriage, about the second year of our marriage, she said, "It's time for you to put a band together. I know who you are. I have all these records up here that you played on. You need to be doing that. I love that you have a day job. You're the only musician I know with a day job. But that being said, you need to have a night job, and the night job is going to be a musician again." And by the way, my ex was a guitar player in your band like 25 years ago. So it's a small world. And she nagged me and nagged me. She was going back to college in her 50s as an adult, and she would sit at her desk, and there was a piano on the other side of the desk. Go over there. She said, "Come over, play some music for me while I'm doing my homework." And she says, "Now write a song." And so I started writing a song, and she went, "Oh, that's a really good musical hook. Keep that. Oh, I really like that." She said, "Now it's time for you to make a record." And I happened to, by coincidence, put my name out there that I was going to do sessions again. Got called to do a session at Robbie Krieger's studio, Horse Latitudes, Robbie Krieger being the guitar player from The Doors. And I was in doing a session that day, and he came through the studio. It's his private studio, and he saw me, and he went, "T-Bear, what you doing here?" And I said, "Everything gonna be all right, man. I'll be playing now." And he said, "Well, that's great. Why don't you come in here and record?" And I said, "Because I don't have deep pockets. I got 3 kids I'm trying to put through school, and I don't have a record deal anymore." He said, "Well, you know what? You come in here when the studio's not being used, and if you pay the engineer, I'll give you the studio, make your record." So Robbie Krieger got me the studio. I cut 23 tracks, 21 originals. And towards the end of the record, when it was getting ready to be mixed, we got some horrifying news. Dino was diagnosed with stage 4 cancer and was dead within a year. So before she died, she wrote me out a note, and it said, "Live your best life, finish your record, never cancel another gig, go out on tour, and fall in love again." So that record was a direct result of Nina, and the last song on it is Nina's song. And that was the first song I wrote when she said, "Write songs again." Somebody from a record company walked in and said, "I want you to come to my house because I want to sign you as an artist, and I want to talk about what I want to do for you." I told him about Nina. I told him about what happened. He said, "I want to sign you." And he signed me. And then the record company said, "We want you to do another record." And that's when The Way of the World came out. And that was The Way of the World during COVID.
So T-Bear was back. You stopped selling light globes. You showed that you were an incredibly dutiful Jewish husband who always listened to their wife twice over.
Twice, yeah.
Yeah. And you were back doing the thing that you loved, making music.
Here's the way I write now. Lyrics first, short stories put to music. You know, when I wrote The Way of the World, I was thinking to myself, because I was really into Bob Dylan that week. And I thought to myself, what would Bob write right about now? And those are the lyrics that I came up with for The Way of the World.
Which is your favourite track on there?
You know, last week it was something different, but this week it's Dinner for One. Last week it was the bonus track, Red Harvest, with Paul Rodgers singing a duet with me. A Change Would Do Me Good went to number one again in the Netherlands. Walter was number one, and I was number four. And then Walter would look at me while we were on tour and he goes, I'm still number one. I said, but I'm climbing. I'm climbing, Wally. And then he was down to number three, and I was number one. And I said, you're number three. I'm number one, Wally. I had a therapist somewhere in Florida because Walter covered one of my songs on this album. It's on his Broken album. It's called Breathe. She contacts me, gets my number, and she says, you know, I'm a therapist and I'm playing that song for people that are going through rough times. I said, this is what you need to put on. And I said, well, why is that? She goes, because it's not therapy, it's baraphy. Baraphy.
Love it. So you've done everything that Nina told you to do.
Yes.
Have you fallen in love again? Have you managed to do that last one?
You know what? I'm seeing somebody.
Lovely. Well, I wish you much continued success. You've got a big heart, Bear.
It's so lovely that you have me on your show, and you're so easy to talk to. And I got to thank you because your questions are really well thought out.
Thank you so much for sharing your stories and your time with us. People may not have known your name before, but I have to tell you, from here on in, they certainly will.